They say the culmination of a career is a moment of pure satisfaction. But for me, standing at the back of the conference room on my final day, it felt less like a celebration and more like a quiet burial. Want to know why my daughter, the one with the perfect, dismissive veneer, finally crumbled the moment she saw the inscription on the old tarnished locket I left behind? Don't blink, because you won't believe what happened next. Retirement. The word itself sounds like a gentle, unhurried exhale, doesn't it? For nearly 40 years, I'd inhabited a world of paperwork, policy, and perpetual negotiation. I'd pictured it as a golden gate to a garden of forgotten hobbies. No more 5 a.m. commutes battling the freeway's frantic tide. No more endless, performative meetings designed only to justify the executive pay grade. And let's be truthful, no more pretending to understand the latest corporate jargon designed to obscure simple truths. I'd spent decades in that office building, watching the generations of digital workers pass through the same security turnstile, marking time by the arbitrary deadlines and the predictable rotation of the break room art. I'd seen colleagues ascend, crash, and burn out, watched the young ones dismiss my methods as archaic, and even survive the transition from paper files to the cloud. Through it all, I kept my head down, executed my duties with methodical thoroughness, and quietly built a respectable retirement account. I wasn't a mover or a shaker, but I was the backbone, the kind of man who always honored a deadline and remembered the name of every single janitorial staff member. So, there I was on my final afternoon, accepting the polite, sterile farewell. It was a strange, muted feeling, a combination of profound relief and an unnerving sense of vanishing. My department had arranged a brief, mandatory gathering complete with a sheet cake that read, "Best wishes, Dad." There were plastic smiles, a few awkward claps, and a lot of surface-level well wishes. I smiled for the camera phone photos, accepted a gift card to a chain restaurant I'd never visit, and tried not to dwell on how easily the corporate machine would replace me by Monday morning. My cubicle, once a small sanctuary cluttered with family photos and worn-out legal pads, was now an empty, impersonal shell. As I walked out of the building for the last time, I felt the familiar weight of my briefcase, but my spirit felt terrifyingly light. The weather was gray, the air thick with the exhaust of 1,000 idling cars, and for a moment, I let myself imagine all the uncharted territory ahead. Maybe I'd finally write that history book I'd always outlined. Maybe I'd take a pilgrimage to the places I'd only read about in atlases. Maybe I'd just sit in my quiet armchair and let the silence seep into my bones. The world felt vast and indifferent, and for the first time in a long time, I was unsure what to be excited about. I drove home, the car silent except for the low hum of the tires on the asphalt. My familiar house looked like a set piece, a stage waiting for the next act. I parked in the garage, grabbed my briefcase and my retirement plaque, and headed for the back door. I was ready to transition. I was ready to share this new, quiet chapter with my daughter, Chloe, the person whose entire education and professional start I had tirelessly funded. Chloe was sitting at the dining room table, her laptop open, aggressively focused on something on the screen. She barely acknowledged my arrival, but I tried not to let it sting. She was 27, a junior executive in a high-pressure marketing firm, and I knew how relentless her world was. I set my briefcase down on the floor with a slight, deliberate sound, trying to draw her attention to the finality of the day. "Well, that's it," I said, trying to keep my voice light, a fragile excitement masking my nerves. "I'm officially on the other side. No more time clocks." She glanced up, her expression a blank slate of commercial ambition. For a split second, I thought I saw a hint of the vulnerable child who used to run to me for comfort after a bad dream. But then she let out a short, cold laugh that was entirely unfamiliar. "So what's the plan then?" she said, her tone sharp, laced with genuine contempt. "You're just going to become a human fixture around here, tinkering in the garden. Honestly, Dad, now that you've stopped being a viable income stream, you're just a liability. You're only good for your investments, old man. That's the only real function you have left." I froze. The words hung in the sterile air, cold and utterly transactional. I tried to dismiss it, thinking maybe she was just parroting the cynical ethos of her corporate environment, but her eyes held a fixed, unwavering belief in the truth of her assessment. My heart clenched into a painful knot, and for a moment, I felt the terrifying sensation of emotional vertigo. Have you ever had your entire life's worth distilled into a line on a quarterly earnings report by the person you sacrificed it all for? Let me tell you, the wound it leaves is deeper than any physical injury. I stood there, plastic plaque in hand, feeling like the foundation of my identity had just been pulled from under me. All those years of skipped promotions because they required too much travel, the second job I took to cover her graduate school tuition, the quiet rejection of my own dreams so hers could be fully funded. It all flashed before my eyes. The late nights at the desk, the cheap lunches, the meticulous saving. I'd done it all for her opportunity. And now, standing in the home I'd provided, I felt like a relic, a piece of outdated machinery waiting for disposal. I wanted to retort, to tell her about the inherent non-financial value of a life lived with integrity, to remind her of the lessons I tried to teach about kindness and honesty, but the words were lodged like concrete in my throat. Instead, I just stood there, blinking against the sudden, hot threat of tears, trying to reconcile the image of the loving father I thought I was with the cold, financial abstraction she had just assigned to me. Was this the final balance sheet of my life? Was this what my dedication had purchased? Chloe went back to her laptop, her face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen, already bored with the human interruption. I watched her for a moment, searching for the child who used to ask me to tell her stories about how the world really worked, the one who used to value my simple, unadorned presence. But she was gone, replaced by a ruthless economist of personal relationships. I carried my briefcase upstairs, each step heavier with the weight of her judgment. In my study, I sat down and let the tears come, slow and painful. I felt foolish for expecting a moment of genuine human connection, for thinking that this day would be about the man, not the metric. I'd spent my whole life being the secure, silent pillar. And now, at the end of the building process, I was simply an empty column. But as I wiped my eyes and looked out at the familiar, unchanging street, a slow, determined anger began to crystallize within me. Maybe, just maybe, this was my chance to finally prove that my essence was unbankable. Maybe retirement wasn't the final ledger. It was the moment to invest in the soul. And maybe, just maybe, I was about to find out who I really was when I wasn't defined by the size of my contribution. But first, I had to figure out what to do about Chloe. Because one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let her cynical valuation be the epitaph of my life. Not now, not ever. I'll be honest with you. After Chloe's calculated cruelty, I spent a few days operating on autopilot. I walked through the motions of a newly retired life, starting projects I couldn't focus on, preparing meals I didn't taste. I kept replaying that moment, analyzing the exact emotional inflection of her contempt, wondering if I'd missed the signs of her growing entitlement, or if maybe I truly undervalued my own non-financial contributions. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I was tired. Tired of being the reliable baseline that was never appreciated until it went silent. Tired of being the generational safety net. Tired of feeling like the only love I received was transactional, a payment for my long-term security planning. I'd spent my whole life making sure everyone else's financial house was in order. And where had it gotten me? Isolated in my own success, with a daughter who saw me as nothing more than a legacy fund waiting to mature. Now, I could have drafted a bitter letter of disinheritance. I could have begged for her respect. I could have tried to force an emotional conversation or maybe even used a good, old-fashioned financial threat to bring her to heel. But the truth is, I was finished with managing her reality. Done with the emotional cost. Done with waiting for her to see me as anything other than a means to an end. So, I did what any self-respecting, detail-oriented man who understood leverage would do when facing an ethical impasse. I decided to initiate a quiet, absolute detachment of services. I decided to subtly, but completely, remove myself as an accessible financial factor. Not in a tragic, media attention-grabbing way, but in a let's see how you quantify a crisis when the emergency fund suddenly has a lock on it kind of way. First, I became ruthlessly practical, creating a financial perimeter. I sat down at my old desk with a cup of lukewarm coffee and my ledger, and I started making a checklist for financial self-extraction. Closed every joint credit line. Check. Transferred the vast majority of my liquid assets into an unadvertised, high-interest-bearing account in a regional bank far from the city. Check. Called the financial planner and restructured my will to explicitly define a small, fixed-sum annuity for Chloe, with the bulk of the estate dedicated to a scholarship fund for underprivileged students. Check. I even called the property tax office and had all non-essential mail forwarded to a temporary P.O. box. Let her deal with the sudden, mundane administrative friction of living independently for once. It was oddly exhilarating, like performing a clean, non-reversible severance of a dependency. Every time I crossed something off the list, I felt a little lighter, a little more autonomous, a little more in control of my true independence. Next came the hardest part, packing up the true mementos. I didn't take much, just a single, worn-out backpack of clothes, my oldest, most meticulously annotated books on history and philosophy, and a few artifacts that still whispered of my former, idealistic self. I left behind the rest, including the expensive furniture she always admired, and the status symbols I had unwillingly accumulated over the years. I figured if she valued the stuff so highly, she could have the illusion of the comfortable home, but without the easy access to the source of that comfort. But before I left, I knew I had to leave a quiet testament, a final, undeniable statement about value. Not a long, complex philosophical essay, just a note, something that would cut through her financial cynicism and land with the weight of simple, irrefutable truth. I sat at my desk, pulled open the small, hidden compartment where I kept my grandfather's tarnished silver locket, the one engraved with the single word, integrity, and I wrote, on a small piece of aged parchment, "Chloe, I gave you every financial advantage and security, but I forgot to give you the chance to value the inheritance that has no market price. Now it's your turn to measure a life by what is kept, not by what is spent. Love, Dad." I folded the note carefully, placed it inside the locket, and left the heavy, tangible piece of metal on her pillow, right where she'd have to confront its meaning. And before you ask, no, it wasn't just the password to my main investment account, though the thought of her frustrated attempts to crack the metaphor made me almost smile. Walking out of that house and closing the door behind me was the most definitive act of my life. I half expected the alarms to blare, for her to emerge from her room demanding an explanation for the sudden administrative friction. But the house was quiet, insulated by its very luxury. Just the gentle tick of a grandfather clock I'd inherited and the distant, muffled sound of the city, the sound of her world. I closed the door behind me and took a deep, liberating breath of the cool, morning air. For the first time in decades, I felt financially exposed, and in that exposure, I felt truly liberated. I didn't have a 5-year plan. I just knew I needed to get away, to shed the skin of the provider and figure out what meaning I had left to contribute to the world. I checked into a little, overlooked boarding house near a historic liberal arts college town, the kind with worn-out velvet furniture and the constant scent of old paper and brewing tea. It wasn't modern, but it was mine. I spent the first night eating a simple sandwich and reading a dusty old treatise on classical ethics, feeling equal parts uncertain and beautifully disconnected. I kept waiting for the emergency call, for Chloe to demand to know why the latest statement didn't reflect the usual transfers. But the phone stayed silent. The next morning, I woke up early and went for a long, reflective walk through the college campus. The air was crisp, the sky a clear, uncompromising blue, and I felt like I was seeing the world without a budget line item for the first time in years. I stopped at a small, independent coffee shop for breakfast, and the young student behind the counter called me Professor and poured me endless cups of strong, artisanal brew. I chatted with a couple of philosophy majors at a counter, discussing the true meaning of legacy and sharing a few quiet, non-corporate insights of my own. For the first time in a long time, I felt like a scholar, not just a steward of paper. As the days passed, I started to settle into my new, contemplative routine. I read books, took long, purposeful walks through the surrounding forests, and even started a detailed research project on the ethics of the Industrial Revolution. I called an old university friend, a former history professor who had retired years before, and we met for a long, passionate discussion, reminiscing about the days when ideas mattered more than execution and making plans to audit a few lectures together. I started to remember who I was before I became dad and the financial security blanket. I was still scared, of course, scared of running out of time, scared of being alone, scared of what the future might hold without the secure, professional identity I'd worn for decades. But I was also excited. Excited to see what I could learn without the pressure of having to monetize it, who I could become now that I was finally living for intellectual and personal growth. But every now and then I'd think about Chloe. I wondered what she was doing, how she was coping without the ease of my financial cushion. I wondered if she missed me or just the comfort of her security. I wondered if she'd found the locket, read my note, and if the tarnished silver had felt impossibly heavy in her hand. I hoped in some quiet way that my profound act of withdrawal would be the existential shock she needed, because sometimes the only way to teach someone the true value of an abstract concept like love or dignity is to completely remove the financial scaffolding and force them to confront the vacuum. And as I sipped my coffee in that small, warm coffee shop, surrounded by the quiet hum of independent thought, I realized something important. I wasn't running away from my responsibilities. I was finally running towards the only thing that could not be taken from me, my own inherent dignity. I'll admit the first few months were a profound test of my resolve. I was in my late 60s, alone, and suddenly free in a way that was both exhilarating and profoundly unsettling. There's a strange kind of intellectual silence that descends upon you after so many years of being bombarded by the constant, necessary chatter of the corporate world. No one calling for an urgent policy review. No one asking for a final signature. No one needing a difficult negotiation navigated. At first, that silence felt like a loss of identity, a cold reminder of my sudden irrelevance. But as the weeks passed, I started to realize it was actually a gift, a boundless, quiet space for my own, long-neglected thoughts to finally bloom. Of course, I had no immediate curriculum. I'd spent so long following the rigid protocols of my career that I'd forgotten how to self-direct my own intellectual curiosity. So, I started small, leaning into the simplest, most fundamental aspects of my nature. I took long, meditative walks through the college arboretum, letting my mind wander wherever the unpaved paths led. I found a local, independent library that focused on rare book restoration and, on a whim, decided to volunteer. The first time I successfully mended a broken binding on a 200-year-old philosophical text. I stood there with the scent of aged paper and new glue in the air and felt a pure, profound connection to the past. I felt skilled. I felt useful. I felt like maybe, just maybe, I could transfer a legacy that was purely intellectual. Next, I started auditing lectures at the college, focusing on ancient history and classical literature. I hadn't opened a textbook for the joy of learning in decades. But sitting in that lecture hall, surrounded by young, hungry minds, arguing about the motivations of long-dead emperors and the meaning of a 1,000-year-old poem, I felt a vital spark I hadn't felt in ages. We debated, we challenged assumptions, we shared profound moments of discovery over cheap cafeteria coffee. I made friends, real friends, not just people I knew through the lens of a professional network. For the first time in decades, I was learning for the inherent beauty of the knowledge itself, not for a career advantage. And then, because I figured I had nothing left to lose in the realm of social experimentation, I started hosting a weekly, informal ethics discussion group at the boarding house, open to anyone who wanted to join. Now, let me tell you, that was an adventure. I showed up with my old, worn-out history books and a pot of strong coffee. Turns out there are a lot of people, both young and old, looking for someone who has lived a little, who has confronted moral compromises and has a few intellectual scars to prove it. I talked about professional failures, some small, some hilariously embarrassing. One young man spent an entire evening arguing that my retirement fund was an inherently unethical construct. Another tried to impress me by quoting a long-forgotten Roman legal text. But I didn't mind. For the first time, I was engaging in discourse for the pure, unadulterated love of the intellectual challenge, not for a future legal fee. I was learning to enjoy the unpredictability of human conversation, to say yes to unexpected tangents, to let myself be surprised by the complexity of the human condition. Meanwhile, back in the city, Chloe was navigating a world without my financial certainty. I heard about the fallout through my quiet network, the unexpected taxes, the sudden volatility of the market, the mundane, infuriating administrative chores she had to handle herself. She called. She sent a series of increasingly humble, then desperately apologetic messages. She even sent a hand-delivered note to the boarding house, probably hoping to find the deed to the entire city in a safe deposit box. At first, I maintained my distance. I needed the space, and I wanted her to feel the total, uncushioned weight of her own financial reality. But as the weeks went by, her communication began to shift. The angry, demanding calls about missing assets turned into tearful, heartfelt apologies for her arrogance. The texts went from, "I need to speak to your financial planner," to, "I was reading this book on Stoicism, and I suddenly understood what you meant about internal worth. Dad, I miss you." She even showed up at the college library once, asking a librarian if anyone had seen the older man who fixed the books. They hadn't, but they told her he was probably upstairs passionately debating the ethics of Machiavelli. I'd be lying if I said it didn't hurt to imagine her struggle. I'm a father. It's in my nature to want to solve the problem, to swoop in and restore the equilibrium. But I knew deep down that this was the most important intellectual and moral education she would ever receive. She'd spent her whole life standing on the solid, easy ground of my security, expecting me to manage the risk. Now she had to learn to build her own internal compass. It wasn't easy for either of us, but sometimes the most valuable lessons are those delivered with the sting of unearned hardship. As for me, I kept exploring the boundaries of my new intellectual life. I took a community drawing class and discovered I had a knack for illustrating complex ideas with simple, evocative sketches. I volunteered at the local homeless shelter, not to donate money, but to teach them basic literacy and help them articulate their own life stories, finding a deep sense of purpose in empowering others with the most fundamental human tool: language. I even started writing a memoir, chronicling my journey from corporate anonymity to personal freedom. It was honest. It was flawed, and it was entirely, unapologetically mine. One blustery, clear afternoon, I sat in my small study, sipping tea and watching the students cross the campus green, carrying their backpacks heavy with ideas. I realized I hadn't felt this profoundly alive in a long, long time. I wasn't wealthy in the way Chloe admired. I wasn't professionally powerful. And I certainly wasn't anyone's idea of a success story according to the metrics of her world. But I was happy. I was free. I was living a life where my contributions were judged by their depth and their inherent meaning, not by their financial return. Of course, there were moments of quiet doubt. There were nights when the cold reality of my modest means crept in, when I missed the effortless comfort of my old home or the familiar predictability of a well-staffed office. There were days when I wondered if I'd made a profound, foolish mistake, if I'd traded away a hard-earned security for a quixotic quest for inner truth. But then I'd remember the cold, judgmental look in my daughter's eyes that day, the sharp sting of her words, and I'd remind myself why I left. I deserved more than to be a declining asset on her spreadsheet. I deserved to be seen, to be valued, to be loved for the complexity of the man I was, not just the capital I represented. So I kept learning. I kept teaching. I kept growing. And as the weeks turned into months, I realized that the true measure of a person is not the number on their bank statement, but the integrity of their character, the wealth of their knowledge, and the depth of their capacity for growth. Every new idea I grasped, every old book I mended, every quiet moment of genuine, non-monetary connection I made was a chance to start over, to become the true, complete man I'd always secretly wanted to be. And somewhere along the way I found myself. Not the invisible corporate functionary, not the financial provider, not the obsolete old man my daughter once called me, but the scholar, the mentor, and the father I was always meant to be. Independent, resilient, and unapologetically rich in wisdom. Time has a funny way of dissolving the layers of resentment, leaving behind only the clear, hard truth of love. Months turned into a new academic year, and the profound shift in our relationship continued its quiet, relentless work. Even as I immersed myself in my new life of letters and discourse, I found a rewarding, predictable rhythm in my days. Morning research, afternoons at the library, evenings spent in intense, meaningful discussion with my students and friends. I was learning to thrive in my own company, to savor the quiet moments of reading and reflection, to trust that I could handle whatever came next with the resources of my own mind. But even as my self-sufficiency grew, a deep-seated fatherly need ached for a complete, emotional alignment with Chloe. I missed her, not the abstract idea of a daughter, but the particular, specific human being I had raised. The one who used to crawl into my lap, asking for a story about a historical figure, who used to challenge my assumptions with her bright, quick mind, who used to believe I held the keys to all the world's knowledge. It was a cold, rainy Friday when I finally agreed to meet her. She'd been consistently reaching out, her messages now entirely devoid of financial topics, instead focusing on a difficult ethical problem she'd encountered at work or a challenging philosophical concept she was wrestling with. Each message was a quiet admission of her intellectual respect and a gentle, unspoken plea for my non-monetary counsel. So I said yes. We chose a simple, unremarkable public park bench halfway between my college town and her distant city office, a quiet, neutral space under a massive old oak tree. I arrived early, my mind a whirl of nerves and hopeful expectations, and sat down with a thermos of tea. I watched the path, half hoping she'd show up in a relaxed state, half afraid she'd arrive in her power suit, signaling that the corporate armor was still too thick. When she finally walked into the clearing, I felt a physical shock. She was wearing jeans and a simple, unassuming jacket, and she was carrying a worn-out copy of a classic philosophical text I'd given her years ago. She looked tired, maybe more grounded, definitely less obsessed with the surface of things. There was a genuine intellectual curiosity in her eyes I hadn't seen since she was an undergraduate, but also a quiet, adult sadness. She spotted me and hesitated, then crossed the wet grass with slow, careful steps, shedding the last remnants of her professional urgency. For a long moment, we just stood there, two people who had spent months navigating the emotional distance between them. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small, heavy object, the tarnished silver locket, the one I'd left on her pillow all those months ago. She placed it carefully on the wooden bench between us. "I had to have this polished," she said, her voice barely audible over the gentle drumming of the rain on the leaves. "It was so tarnished, Dad. And I realized I had let my own values tarnish just as badly. I didn't understand your note at first. I was so angry. I thought you were just playing a trick, a cruel financial game, but then the world got hard and the money didn't help, and then I realized you had given me the only real security I would ever need. The knowledge that I could survive without your money. The security of my own mind." I looked down at the locket, remembering the night I placed it there, feeling the terrifying weight of my gamble. I'd been so sure, so resolute, but also so afraid that she would simply discard the metaphor. I wanted her to know my love was unconditional, but I also needed her to understand that unconditional love did not equate to endless, passive funding, that sometimes the most profound act of emotional investment is to demand that a child stand on their own moral and intellectual ground. I reached out and gently slid the locket toward her. "Open it, Chloe," I said, my voice low and steady, a gentle command. "Read the word engraved on the inside." She looked at me, her eyes wet, then slowly, hesitantly, she opened the heavy silver locket. She read the single ancient word inside, integrity. She closed the locket, holding the cold metal tight in her palm. We sat down, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. The sound of the falling rain and the distant, muffled life of the city surrounded us. Finally, Chloe broke the silence. She told me about the months since I'd left, how hard it had been to face the unexpected bills, how many times she'd been tempted to compromise her ethics at work, how many times she'd wanted to pick up the phone and ask me to simply provide the easiest solution. But she didn't. She learned to negotiate with the utility companies, to live within her real means, to handle the small moral dilemmas that used to feel overwhelming. She found a new part-time position teaching a basic ethics course to incoming interns, and made friends who valued genuine debate over social climbing. She even confessed that she had started regularly reading the old philosophy books I had left behind, searching for guidance and a sense of enduring truth. I was so certain that money was the only measure of freedom and value, she admitted, her voice trembling with emotion. But when you left, you took away the very crutch that was preventing me from growing up. I needed to learn how to stand on my own moral feet, Dad. I needed to know I could survive and thrive without your financial protection. And I did. I really did, but only because you gave me the right kind of security. The security of this word. I reached across the small, shared space of the bench and took her hand. Her grip was firm and honest. We sat like that for a while, just holding on, letting the difficult, unquantifiable truth of the last year settle between us. I told her about my own journey, about the fear and the intellectual exhilaration, the new friends and the old ideas I'd rediscovered in that quiet town. I told her about the book restoration, the student debates, the profound joy of intellectual freedom. She smiled, a genuine, warm, and entirely uncalculated expression, and for a moment it was like we'd turned back the clock to the best parts of her childhood. We hugged right there, under the sheltering oak, a long, quiet, emotional embrace, and we both felt the weight of the past lift. Not the bitter, angry weight of abandonment, but the kind that washes away the transactional residue of an imperfect love. For the first time, we saw each other not as a financial gatekeeper and a dependent, not as an invisible provider and an entitled recipient, but as two people, both learning how to live a life defined by true, unbankable worth. We talked for hours, sharing ideas, making plans to meet once a month to discuss a specific philosophical text, promising to communicate on a deeper, more rigorous level. We didn't pretend everything was effortlessly solved. We didn't sweep the hard-won lessons under the rug, but we faced the future together, honestly, bravely, with open minds and a shared sense of ethical purpose. As we left the park, the rain had stopped, and the sun was struggling to break through the clouds. Chloe slipped her arm through mine, a spontaneous, natural gesture that spoke volumes. We walked down the path side by side, not as a father and a child defined by a checkbook, but as equals, two individuals who had been separated by a flawed value system and reunited by the profound power of an intangible idea. Looking back, I realized that locket and the single, simple word inside changed everything. Not just for Chloe, but for me too. It was a visceral, powerful reminder that love isn't about giving so much material comfort that you inadvertently stifle their moral growth. It's about giving them the space to question, to stumble, to find their own internal, non-negotiable definition of integrity. It's about trusting that no matter how far they drift into the superficiality of the modern world, they can always find their way back to the only value that truly lasts, the enduring strength of an honest character. And as we walked into the gentle, returning sunlight, I knew we were both ready for whatever came next, together, but also finally, truly, autonomously, and with integrity as our shared foundation. So, what would you do if you could walk away from your role as the provider? Would you disappear, or would you fight to prove your value beyond the quantifiable? If the story made you laugh, cry, or just think twice about your own true wealth, hit that subscribe button because life doesn't end when the final paycheck clears. It just gets profoundly, beautifully, and ethically interesting. This act of quiet, radical self-redefinition was the ultimate test of my own values, and the locket's final lesson was for me as much as it was for Chloe. The true legacy of a father is not the size of his estate, but the strength of the moral compass he forces his children to rely on. And that, I know now, is a wealth that is utterly, eternally beyond price. The enduring nature of the reconciliation was rooted in the shared, simple act of intellectual pursuit, a complete inversion of our old transactional roles. Chloe, no longer relying on me for financial stability, began to seek me out for philosophical grounding, often calling to discuss a moral quandary at her firm or a complex ethical dilemma she'd encountered in the marketplace. These were not casual chats. They were deep, rigorous exchanges that treated me as a peer, a mentor, an unmonetized resource of wisdom. This was the love I had always craved, the respect for my inner life, and it was freely given only after I had fully withdrawn the other kind of support. It was a profound, delayed validation of my entire life's intellectual self-investment. My own work continued to evolve, moving beyond auditing and book repair to actively mentoring young scholars who felt disillusioned by the commercialization of academia. I started a small, unaccredited program out of the boarding house, calling it the School of Integrity, where the only admission fee was a genuine commitment to intellectual honesty and a willingness to confront one's own biases. I taught them that the most revolutionary thing they could do was to pursue truth without a guaranteed financial outcome, to value dignity over expediency, and to build a life rich in meaning, not just in assets. The irony had become the foundation of my new existence. The corporate world had stripped me bare, forcing me to discover the true, unassailable wealth within. One afternoon, a young, earnest student, utterly confused by the current financial landscape, looked at me and asked, "Professor, if you had all that wealth, why did you give it up for this life?" I paused, looking down at the tarnished locket I now wore around my neck, its weight a constant, comforting reminder. "I didn't give it up," I explained carefully. "I exchanged it. I exchanged a quantifiable, diminishing asset for a non-quantifiable, appreciating asset. I traded a life of passive security for a life of active meaning. The difference, you see, is that the first could be taken from me by the market or by a careless child. The second can only be taken by my own lack of courage. I chose the wealth that I could finally carry with me. Entirely within myself, my new life had few possessions but infinite riches. I had the respect of students, the intellectual companionship of peers, and the hard-won, honest love of a daughter who no longer saw a source of funds, but a source of strength. The ultimate lesson was not for Chloe, but for me. I had spent my life building a perfect financial structure, but it took an act of profound self-destruction to realize that the most important construction was the inner one, and that inner sanctuary, built on the foundations of integrity and love, was the only one that could never be called obsolete.